It's time for Dirt Daily. Today I'm working on Pond Scum. Pond Scum is my 2003 Toyota 4Runner. It's got a V8. We built this on dirt every day. When we built it, the goal was, can we build an independent front suspension 4x4 with big tires and go run big rocks? And we did. We ran Fordyce Trail, and it was a lot of fun. The truck didn't really break. We had minor, if any, issues. And then later on, we took it snow wheeling. Since then, I've run some more trails with it. I've loaned it to some friends, and they've run trails with it. So it's been getting some miles. Not a lot, but it's kind of getting broken in. And kind of realized that there's some things on it I want to change. The front suspension is Marlin Crawler's RCLT, rock crawling long travel, heavy duty suspension. No real major issues up front. I've had a little bit of steering things, but nothing that I really want to complain about on the front end. The rear axle is beefcake. Like, I built the rear axle as kind of a guarantee to get home. It's a Spider Tracks fabricated axle housing, has a dropout third member. The third member is from Gearworks. It's a high pinion 10-inch, so the ring gear is bigger than a Ford 9-inch and way bigger than the stock Toyota rear differential. Plus, it has unit bearings out on the end, which are strong, the same things that they run in a lot of race cars, King of the Hammers type stuff. And then the axle shafts, not 30, not 35 spline, 40 spline axle shafts. Big, beefy parts. The whole idea being, if we are on the trail, we have any issues with the IFS, I want a rear axle that I can depend on to get us off the trail. Luckily, we've not had any issues with the IFS. So, but I do like the security of it, and you know, maybe down the road we would want to race this thing because it has this independent front suspension. We'd have to put a cage in, a bunch of other stuff, but I think that having that beefy rear axle will only make it better. That brings me up to one of the things that I want to change. When I built it, we were kind of like post-pandemic, right when like the entire universe was on universal back order. You couldn't get as many parts as you can nowadays. And one of the things that I wasn't able to source was a selectable locker for the rear axle. I got a spool. Spools are cool. Like, they're strong, they're reliable, they're just like idiot proof. And what a spool is, it's a chunk of steel that your ring gear bolts to. And then when the drive shaft turns the pinion, which turns the ring gear, the spool sends power out to both axle shafts, and they both turn your tires. And they don't allow any differentiation from one tire to the other. Like, if one side turns, the other side's gonna turn because it's a spool, it's locked. It's like a welded differential. It's just all one chunk, which you would think would be great, and it is for racing, but if you want to street drive something with a spool, you start noticing a few things. One, every time you make a turn, the tires bind. And when they bind, the tires chirp. So you're like going around a corner, like pulling into a parking spot, and it's like, and it's like, who let the dogs out? Like, the thing is chirping and bouncing and trying to get into the parking spot. Two, it kills tires. Like, the rear tires on this truck have significantly less tread than the front, just from running a spool. And three, like, when you do try to park something, like, the torque and the lack of twist kind of translates into the suspension. So you pull into a parking spot and the whole truck is like twisted, and then you back it up and it twists the other way. So it's like, it kind of binds the entire vehicle. So spool, great for off-road. But also, on the other hand, like, when you are off-road, like, the spool likes to go straight. It likes to just force the truck the direction that the rear tires are pointed. You can steer and it can kind of work around, but if you were able to unlock that differential, it would be way easier to crawl around things and like around trees and around logs. And if you're like on a tight trail and you want to kind of weave your way through stuff, having the ability to unlock the differential is just another tool in your toolbox. At the time we built it, the spool was available. It was cheap, it was handy, it was on the shelf, and I could get one. And we got the truck done, and we've been wheeling it like that. Since then, everybody's inventory's gone up, and I was able to get my hands on an ARB Air Locker. This is the competition Air Locker. It allows for 40 spline axle shafts. We don't have to change anything, and I finally got my hands on one. So my plan now is to pull the axle shafts out, pull the differential, the third member out, and take the third member with the spool and the ring and pinion and the air locker and take it over to Gearworks and let those guys reassemble everything so that it has an air locker in the third member. That will allow me the ability to lock and unlock the differential. If I'm on the street and I don't need the thing to have traction to both tires, I can unlock it. If I'm on the trail and I'm weaving around tight stuff, or like a lot of times when I'm wheeling with Dave, if he's in a rig that has selectable lockers, it's kind of becomes a game. Which of us can get up an obstacle without turning the lockers on? With a spool, it's like you're gonna get power to everything. This becomes another fun thing for four-wheeling, because it's like, yeah, I'm gonna try this line and with diffs open and see if I can climb up this thing. And then like, he calls them the cheater switches. You flip the switches, sends power to every diff, every tire, and the thing crawls right up. So I'm going to get the spool out of the back of this, put an air locker in it for now. I'll probably keep the spool, maybe down the road we'll put it back in if we ever want to go racing, but for now I want to get that air locker in. The front already has an air locker, so I already have a compressor, I already have the switches, most of it's already figured out. So now I'll just add the air locker to the rear. Some people are not fans of selectable lockers because they have had experiences where things didn't work. 9 out of 10 times the problem is installation error. If the hose that runs air to the air locker is near the exhaust and melts, or it gets hooked on something, or it's hanging low and can get snagged by a branch or a rock and get broken, or the fittings aren't put in right and it doesn't seal good, or the wiring isn't right. Like, when it's all done right, the things are pretty reliable and pretty bulletproof. Plus, you don't want to crash lock a selectable locker. And what that means is you don't want to flip the switch while the tires are spinning. So like if you're on the hill and the thing's like, rah! You're like, oh, I forgot my locker. Like, stop. Just stop the vehicle, flip the switch, let it lock, ease into it, and then you can crawl up stuff. The idea of like flipping a switch, like you're basically trying to get this thing to go together. And if you do that when the tire's spinning, things are gonna break. Even as strong and as beefy as a lot of these parts are, like things can still break. Spools, probably stronger, probably more idiot proof, and less expensive. But I think for this truck, I want something that's more well-rounded, something that I can get in, drive long distances, it doesn't destroy my tires. When I get there, I can wheel. If I need a locker, I can flip the switch and have power to both tires, and then get off the trail, unlock everything, and drive home. So I've run spools and stuff and they're cool, but I think now I want to put a selectable locker in, and at the very least, it'll save my tires. And these tires aren't cheap. Like, tires are expensive. So I think for now, I'm going to switch the tires around, but more importantly, I'm going to get that spool out and put a selectable in so that I can take it wheeling and drive it more. Drive it everywhere. All right, let's get to work. This is the rear axle. It's kind of like a full floater axle. If you've ever seen a 14 bolt or a Sterling, a heavy duty 3/4 ton. It basically has a cap and then an axle shaft that runs in there. Usually on those types of axles, the cap that bolts on as it slides out, it's actually part of the axle shaft. On the Spider Tracks, it's different because it doesn't have a spindle with a hub that rides on it. It has a unit bearing, which is what you would find on like the front axle of a heavy duty truck. But Spider Tracks has like this ultimate unit bearing that they build, and they're awesome. They're super beefy. They work great off-road racing. I've run them on a lot of different stuff, and I'm a diehard fan of the Spider Tracks unit bearings. So in order to get the spool out, you need to pull the axle shafts out. So there's axle shafts stick in either side of the spool. You need to just slide them out, and they don't have to come all the way out. You just have to come out a little bit so that the third member can come out. So the first thing you do, you get in here and you unbolt these 4 little bolts. Let me see here. And then that allows the whole cap to come off. Throw those up there. And this cap, it basically seals up against that side of the unit bearing. And then right there is the axle shaft. So what we need to do is get in here. The axle shaft has like a little snap ring, so it won't fall too far in. And then there's also right here, kind of around the unit bearing, there's an O-ring, and that O-ring kind of keeps mud and junk from getting into the axle shaft. So in order to get that axle shaft out, I'm just going to use a little pry bar. It just has like a 90-degree hook under it. And I'm going to reach in here and get underneath that snap ring. So I can kind of just, it doesn't take much. This thing is just, you basically wiggle it a little and then it will start walking out of there. There it goes. You can see the axle shaft is starting to slide out. So I'm gonna lay another pry bar under it here and, oh, come on. There it goes. Boom. So when this thing slides out, that's really all the farther it has to come out. And it just kind of gets tight in there because these splines are splining into the unit bearing, and the splines on the other side are splining into that spool. I can tell once it's out a little and kind of fallen down, then it's out of the third member. So then we can move underneath and pull the third member out. This is the third member, the Gearworks high pinion 10-inch third member that I'm going to remove. This holds the spool, and this will hold the air locker after it's rebuilt. First, I have to remove the drive shaft. You can see how the drive shaft, you just see like the bottom portion of it. That's because of the high pinion gear set. The pinion is way up at the top of the axle. So most of the time, like right now it's at full droop, and the drive shaft at this end is just barely flush with the bottom of the gas tank skid and the exhaust. Most of the time when it's sitting on its weight, the drive shaft's gonna be tucked way up inside here, fully protected. Pretty beefy drive shaft. I think it's built by my friends at Driveline Tech. So it is pretty beefy, and I have run these on other rock crawlers. I think they made the drive shafts that are on clampy, and I've abused them over the years, but it's still better to have it kind of tucked up out of the way. You won't knock the weights off, you won't ding it, and it will survive better, especially on a truck that you want to use both on-road and off-road. Keeping it balanced and free of scuffs is the way to go. So I'm going to disconnect the drive shaft, get it up out of the way, and then I'm going to go around all of these nuts that hold the third member in, and then this will all come out. This thing's full of gear lube. It's going to make a giant mess, but that's the next step. There it goes. Pop that out of the way. Compress this a little bit. All right, so this needs to go up high. I got a bungee here. I'm gonna try to get this tucked up here out of the way and rotate it so that the U-joints don't want to fall. Okay, there we go. Drive shaft is kind of tucked up. Next is get all of these nuts off of here. I think most of these I can hit with an impact. Maybe some of these top ones I'll have to get with a wrench. These are grade 8 nylocks, these little fasteners. I'm probably going to want to replace these because you don't really want to reuse nylocks. This rear diff has some 250 weight gear lube in it, and I want to kind of inspect it a little bit so I can see if it's like full of metal, if there's any issues, but I also need to just drain it into this tub. So I'm going to put this towel up here and like try and catch it, but it'll also be able to flow off the towel. My idea being that if I can just Oh wow, look at that. That stuff looks perfect. I mean, it only has a handful of trail rides on it, but it's like nice and amber. It's not burnt or black. It's not glittery. Doesn't look like it has any metal in it. I believe I used a gasket on this instead of like our TV or any sort of glue, which is probably why it is coming apart so easily. So this thing's going to sit here and drain. We need to drain it down enough that we can get the diff out without it pouring all over us. It also doesn't smell bad. Sometimes you open these axles up and they smell burnt. They just smell nasty. This gear lube is probably fine. It probably could have been saved if I would have had a super clean bucket or something to put it in. But I'm kind of going with the idea that if I'm opening it up, it's going to get fresh oil. This type of gear lube that Gearworks recommends, it's not cheap, but I don't remember exactly how much it is. I do remember it was expensive, but you know what? That's kind of the pay to play if you want to have these nice parts. Gearworks recommends a certain type of oil because of the high pinion and the way they set it up. So they're the experts. I try to listen to them and put in what they recommend to put in. Try to get the catch pan out of the way so I can get a good grip on it. There it goes. Oh yeah. A little bit more oil coming. Oh yeah, a lot more oil coming. Something tells me I'm going to end up covered in oil. Maybe we'll just let it sit here for another minute and drain out. Try not to rush the program too much. Oh, come on, you. There it goes. Oh, yeah. Oh, boy. That's heavy. Here is my Gearworks high pinion 10-inch. There you can see how the pinion is way up here. This part in here is the spool. And that's where the 40 spline axle shafts slide in. So basically an axle shaft goes in each side here. And then as the pinion turns, the ring gear turns, and that turns the axle shafts, which turn the tires. So this is the section that will be replaced with the ARB Air Locker. That's the spool right in there. This thing looks good. I'm gonna wrap it up, get ready to ship it off to Gearworks with the Air Locker and get this thing rebuilt. Here it is. This is the ARB Air Locker, part number RD249CE. That's the competition edition, 40 spline axle shafts. This will replace that spool. So I'm going to take this box and the box with the third member, run it over to Gearworks in Las Vegas, and they can swap it all over, double check everything, button it all up. And then in a few days or a few weeks, whatever their timeline is, I will get it back and put it back in Pond Scum, and then I'll be able to have a rig that not only still works great off-road, but also works better as a daily driver, trail rig, camping rig, exploring rig, going to get coffee rig, haul the dogs rig, go to get parts, grocery getter. All right, let's take all this stuff to Vegas. I'm back. I am back from Gearworks in Las Vegas. And here is my new differential. See if I can lift it out of here without smashing a finger. All right. Oh boy, that's heavy. So this is the high pinion 10-inch from Gearworks. It has a 543 ring and pinion, and where it used to have a spool, now it has an ARB Air Locker. The way the Air Locker works is there's a fitting right here on the front side of the differential, and this is the part that is outside of the axle housing. Basically, this flange right here is what bolts up to the axle housing. And that fitting is where an air line will run up to an air compressor and a control solenoid. The way it'll work is you'll flip a switch, turn on the air compressor, flip another switch, and that'll either activate an air solenoid, or it can just have a pneumatic switch that will allow air pressure to come from the air compressor down to this fitting. Once it's there, it'll go inside the axle housing itself, and that's where you see this copper line. The copper is used because of the heat that the axle can see instead of like a plastic housing. And that copper line runs inside and goes to a collar, and when you activate it, air pressure goes to this collar and it locks together, making it essentially a spool, which is the same as what we had in it before, but the benefit is that you can unlock it for tighter turning and also for on-street use when you don't want the tires scrubbing around every corner you go. Differential is a 40 spline, so it'll match up with the axle shafts that we have in the 4Runner. They also offer this in a 35 spline. They offer it in all different axle sizes and for all types of different axles, whether it's Toyota, Dana styles, Ford 9-inch, or this race style high pinion Gearworks 10-inch. The housing, I took it out to Las Vegas. Gearworks went through the whole thing. They reused most of the components, and I just brought back the whole third member with the air locker installed. Some cool things about the Gearworks high pinion is it also has these load bolts, and the way those work is it's like a bolt that is right behind the ring gear. So if you're under really heavy loads and the ring gear wants to deflect from the pinion ever so slightly, that load bolt can kind of just kiss it and push it back, keep it in line. So this is kind of a neat thing that you see on some dropout style axles. And not very many Dana housings have that, but I have seen them on 9-inch styles and actually some old school, like big heavy duty truck axles, third members have a load bolt there. So I'm going to lift this thing up and put it in there. Also, the other thing I did was I picked up some 250 weight gear oil for the rear axle. The guys at Gearworks sell this, so you can order it there, or there's different places. They recommend this Maxima Pro Gear 250 weight. So let's lift this thing up and put it in the rear end. The next step is to put the differential back in, but before I do, I'm going to reuse the lube locker. The lube locker is a reusable gasket. You can see these kind of orange stripes. Those are actually where it seals up against the face of the housing, as well as on the sealing surface of the third member. Some people don't like these. I've had pretty good luck with them over the years. Some people just say just use RTV or silicone or something to seal that up. I'm going to stick with the lube locker for now because it hadn't been leaking before. Grab that third member, try to stuff it up in here, get some of those nuts on it, and then we will get ready to put the axle shafts in. Here we go. All right. Get up in there, you big heavy thing. Being careful not to smash any fingers or that copper line. Oh, I got it twisted just a little. And of course it's covered in gear lube, so it doesn't want to just move easily. There it goes. There it goes. Boom. All right. Woo. Put 2 nuts on just for safety, so that it doesn't fall back out. Right there is that airline that I was talking about. Put the rest of these new nylocks on. Now we have to put the axle shaft into the air locker. And the thing about an air locker versus a spool is an air locker has kind of a plate in the middle where a spool is usually hollow all the way through. So if you order a custom Spider-Trax axle for a spool, you may need to trim the axles to fit in an air locker. I believe when I ordered these, I ordered them for the air locker because I was at the time hoping that I was going to have an air locker, and I ended up with the spool, so they shouldn't need to be shortened. Now, what I would like to do is slide them out and just make sure there's a little bit of grease on the ends of the splines, both on the inside and the outside, because they're going to spline onto the unit bearing on the outside, but then also into the air locker. So make sure the ends are nice and greased up, and then this will nice and easily, you just got to get them just right, and then they'll slide in there. That slides in. Now, at this point, the axle shaft is kind of laying down in the housing, and you want to kind of pry it up a little so that it lines up with the splines in the air locker. And there's only, I don't know, 2 inches of axle that's hanging out here. But luckily, Spider-Trax put a little hole in the end of the axle, so you can grab like a big beefy screwdriver and slide it in there, and then that gives you a little bit more leverage, and everything just kind of slides in. So right here is a snap ring, and that goes up against this outer edge of the unit bearing. I'm gonna make sure this is nice and flush. Clean it up really good. Now you can see there's a rubber O-ring right here, and that's what's going to seal the cap. And this axle is kind of sitting flush down on there, and everything turns nice and smooth. So the next step is I think we'll just put a little grease on the outside of those splines, and then we'll bolt the cap on. Put the axle shaft back in on both sides. This side, the driver's side, took a little bit of convincing with a little rubber mallet, but it went in smooth. It was just kind of a little tight. The other side, of course, passenger side, fell right together, no problem. I put a little grease on the outside here. There's an O-ring there that will seal up against the inside of the Spider-Trax cap. And next, I just need to line this up with some of the holes in the unit bearing. I'm running the same 6-lug pattern that the Toyota came with. The unit bearings in the back are 5/8 wheel studs instead of the standard Toyota style. I do want to update the front factory Toyota unit bearing on the front with some larger wheel studs, just so that everything matches all the way around. But I had the trail ready wheels machined to work over that big center board that needs to go over the Spider-Trax unit bearing, and to take the 5/8 wheel studs. So the back end of this truck is pretty beefcake, and now having an air locker back here, it's going to be that much nicer for everyday driving. And for four-wheeling, actually. Yeah. I'm going to tighten up this cap, then I'm going to put the other side cap on and bolt on the drive shaft, and then I just have to plumb the air locker up to the air compressor. I got the air line from the firewall down, followed kind of the brake lines, tucked it in board of the frame, like where the rock sliders are, so it's not going to get snagged on anything. It's on the driver's side, so it's away from most of the heat from the exhaust. And then it dumps over the gas tank and loops down with a little bit of extra so that it can move with the axle. Now, ARB used to supply a blue line, which was 5mm. Now they've stepped it up to 6mm with this black line. One of the things about the line is you probably will have to cut it. Most likely they sent more than what you need for your vehicle. don't go and grab these. These are your basic wire cutters, dikes, side biters, whatever you call them. If you cut with those, it'll squash the line. And then where the fitting goes on there, it won't be square, you'll have to come back in with this, kind of get it round and open up that oval. Basically, waste of time. Grab something like this. Husky makes these. I've seen them used for cutting PVC. They kind of have a double flat spot, so the line sits across both of those, and then the blade comes down, and it's kind of a ratcheting style. And you put that in there, and boom, cuts it off nice and square. Or you can grab the same tool you use to cut like hard lines for brake systems. This one's from Earl's, but there's other companies that make them. And you basically, it has like a little roller blade down in there, and then it tightens up against there. You roll it around, and every time you roll it around, you turn it in a little bit tighter. And what that does is it slowly feeds that blade down into the line, cutting it off perfectly square, nice and smooth, almost nothing to clean up. So, but grab your glasses and double check, make sure there's nothing in there, no little flap of plastic that's fallen over the hole, and then you'll have a nice, good seal. So, I'm going to finish buttoning up on the rear diff. I just have to plug it into that fitting. I was going back to fill up the rear axle, and I think you guys want to check this out. That's the factory Toyota skid plate under the gas tank. It's hammered. It's still doing its job. I mean, there is like a rock stuffed inside this hole, which is probably not the best because it's wedged between the gas tank and the skid plate. But I mean, there's no holes in the gas tank yet. There's no leaks. So if you have any suggestions on a better aftermarket skid plate, hit me up, because I think I might need to find a replacement eventually. This thing's like abused all the way through. It's been doing its job, but it'd be nice to have something a little beefier. Otherwise, it's pretty good under here. The rear link hanger on this corner is a little bit wonky as well. That probably needs straightened out. Thing's seen some rocks. Kind of surprised the stock muffler hasn't been ripped off. I love that the Spider Trax housing has this massive fill hole, and I'm just gonna dump this goo in here. I did this once before, but I honestly cannot remember how much it took. I'm assuming it's going to be more than a gallon. Has to fill up the center section, and it will fill up the axle tubes out to the unit bearings. You want to fill it up to about halfway up the axle shaft, so about halfway. And honestly, what I should have done was taken this jug inside, put it by the wood stove for a little bit so it warms up, gets a little bit more viscous, less viscous, more flowing, whatever the proper nomenclature is for thinner, so that it flows better. Being 250 weight, it's some pretty heavy syrup to go in there. I'm going to fill this up, and then we just have to find a spot to mount a solenoid under the hood, and I think the 4Runner is back in action, and I can finally drive it without eating these tires. All right, I routed the airline up on the driver's side and then across the back of the engine bay, and it's coming right here where it will plug into the solenoid on my air compressor. On this vehicle, Scum, I just use the really small air compressor because it's only running the air lockers, and now it has air lockers front and rear. So it's fine for that. I don't think I would air up tires off that little compressor. It's pretty small. I'd probably get a bigger one, which I'll probably do eventually, is mount a bigger air compressor in the back. That's about it for this dirt daily. I need to get one little fitting for my airline, so I can't actually test the air locker right now. So I ordered up one of those fittings. It's just a little push lock fitting so that the airline will press into the solenoid. The way it works is you have basically 3 switches. One switch will turn on the air compressor and pressurize the little tank on the air compressor. And then you have a switch for each solenoid, front or rear. And the solenoid is like a valve that sends air pressure down to the locker, which engages the locker, and then it makes it into a spool. Most of the time you can drive, I can drive it right now without that because I don't need it as a locker right now. But before I take it wheeling again, I need to get that little fitting and button up all of the plumbing and the wiring. So pretty stoked. Pond Scum can leave the shop. There's other things I have to do to this truck. There's actually a lot of things. I have a little issue with the front steering, which I got to look into next. It's kind of the next major project. I want to redo a few things on the body. When we took all the plastic cladding off, there's a bunch of little holes, and I just kind of painted that lower section with like that splatter paint. I might change that down the road. I'm kind of over that look. So stay tuned for more Pond Scum videos in the future. But for now, I think having the air locker installed will make it a much nicer vehicle. It's pretty simple install on this vehicle in particular. You just pull those axle shafts out, pull the third member out, rebuild the third member, put the third member back in, reconnect the drive shaft, put the axle shafts back in, and now you have a selectable locker in the rear end. The only other vehicle that I can think of that would be that easy would probably be like an FJ80 Land Cruiser, which also the later ones have the full floating axles, and those you can also undo the bolts and slide the axle shafts out without having to take the whole back of the wheel apart, the whole wheel end, axle end. In fact, you can do it leaving the tires and wheels on, which is pretty cool. So that's it for this Dirt Daily. Pond Scum's leaving the shop. I have other things to bring in here and work on. We will see you guys next time.